Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to go over setup and execution and the biomechanics behind appropriately performing lying leg curls. So first things first, I'm not even going to start playing the video, and many of you may intuitively be like, Ben, we got to see the motion, we got to see it moving, right? That is mistake number one with the lying leg curl that people make, is they assume that, like people assume with many other machines, that the setup is simple and that the execution is the thing that needs to be complexified or mystified. But as is the case with many machines, our setup really is going to determine how easy or how not easy it is to execute the motion appropriately. Okay, so first things first, pad placement on the legs. A lot of people start off with a femur position. Here's my femur, or my leg, that is way too far off of the pad. So if this is my knee right here, a lot of people start with their knee somewhere over here in this territory, right? Basically where a lot of their quad, if you could picture these are the quads over here, are sort of hanging off of this, right? We don't want that. The first thing we want to make sure of is that we place the lower part of our quads somewhere on the end of this pad so that our patella, in other words, our kneecap, is hanging off of this thing. But we want to basically place as far down on the quads as possible so that we can actually just support the hips, right? This is, in essence, our primary anchor for the exercise, right? Where we're getting most of the stability to be able to actually curl this thing upward toward our butts. So first things first is set the femur position such that the lower part of the quads is on the pad, but that the kneecap is not. You want to be able to sort of move your kneecap freely. Number one. Number two, when you're setting your legs down, I don't have the perfect perspective for this, so apologies for this. I want you all to, as a point of reference, to kiss your legs together. In other words, you have your inner thighs, touch your inner thighs together before you place yourself down, and make sure that your kneecaps are pointing down toward the floor. That arrow is not super clear. Here's the arrow I was intending to make there. And the reason that this is important is because of the fact that the knees are hinge joints. In other words, they bend in one direction, right? Much like my elbow bends in one direction, my knees just go forward and backward, or forward and backward in whatever direction my hips are pointed. And so because of that, we want to load the knees in that straightforward to backward direction. And so if we basically lie down like most people naturally do, with the femurs kind of rotated outward, in other words, like picture my feet turning outward, like duck feet outward, a lot of people will naturally lie down like that instead of touching their femurs together and making sure their kneecaps are pointed down. And what that does is it sort of sets the knee on a trajectory that is not in line with how this thing is pushing us. And so in simpler terms, start out, again, it's just a starting point. These are all starting point recommendations. Start out by touching your inner thighs together and then plopping yourself down, making sure that your kneecaps are pointed toward the ground. Okay, so step one, lowest part of the quad. Step two, once you have that lowest part of the quad on, make sure your legs are touching, and then fold yourself over to sit down. Okay, the next thing to consider, and this is true throughout the entirety of the set, I'll let this play in a second when we actually look at execution, is notice hand position over here. All right, so I will fast forward in the video just a little bit so I can move that text around, because, by the way, this is just text from my exercise library, which we'll talk about later, because I have a holiday sale going on. So here is the handle, right? My intent to pull on the handle is not to pull directly backward this way or to curl it upward this way. It's kind of, and you'll naturally sort of get a feeling for this when you start to pay attention, it's kind of like I'm pulling upward and backward in this direction. So I'm not just hunkering down like I'm doing a pull down, and I'm not pulling up on it like I'm doing a curl, somewhere in between. But what you will feel is you will feel that just holding onto the handles tightly you'll kind of be able to orient yourself there. I would start, however, with the intent to sort of pull the handles that way, almost like you're doing a lat pull down or like a row with your arms tight to your body. Okay, so make sure that at no point do you lose contact here or do you lose contact here, because everything in between these 2 points, this whole thing right here, a lot of people will start to move all over the place, shift their whole body this way, or have their pelvis sort of tipping forward and backward in this direction like they're twerking or something, just because of the fact that they're losing precise contact here and they're forgetting about this. So these are your two anchor points and these are your two reference points to begin the motion. Lastly, before I let this play, pad placement. I don't think pad placement is hugely relevant outside of just making sure that the pad isn't really smushing your calf in any uncomfortable way. I think it's fine to have the pad here. I think it's fine to have the pad here. It's fine to have the pad here, just as long as it is in a comfortable position. And as long as when you go through the motion, it's not rolling downward, I think you're in a good position. And so what you'll observe, now that I'll let this play, is that as I go through the motion, the pad is actually rolling upward on my leg as opposed to downward. And I mean that in the sense that as I curl upward, the pad is rolling closer to my knee. And let's talk about why. So here's a reference point for the top. Actually, I'll go back to the beginning here. So here is a reference point for the bottom. Okay, so like right below the belly of the calf is where I have it set. And then as I curl up, you'll notice it actually goes a little bit higher. You can kind of see if I slow this down, the pad rolls just a little bit upward closer to my knees in this position. And then it starts to roll on the way down. So you can kind of see, hopefully you can see that clearly enough, the pad rolling upward and downward as I curl. So why might that be useful? Well, if we think about it, let's talk about some basic physics stuff. If the pad is pushing down on my leg here, it is that far from my leg, right? In other words, it is X challenging on my leg, okay? But as I curl to the top, if the pad gets substantially closer and I draw my line of force again, now that it's here, now all of a sudden it is X distance from my leg, okay? So the starting position, the pad was maybe somewhere here, and now it's somewhere here. So it's just moved this much closer. In other words, from what we would call a moment arm perspective, which is, you can think about a moment arm as basically like a distance which determines how much resistance is actually acting on this joint. When we move the pad closer to the joint, it is actually easier for us to curl the pad. And so this is all a sort of roundabout way of saying that if the pad rolls closer to your knee as you curl upward, it's actually going to more appropriately match how much resistance you can create against the pad moving up to the top. In other words, at baseline, we are weaker from a muscular perspective at the top than we are at the bottom. And so the pad rolling up just a little bit closer to the knee is actually helpful because we're able to actually match our strength with how much force, or rather how much resistance, this pad is pushing on us. Now, if that didn't make any sense to you, that's perfectly fine. What I would recommend is basically just to get yourself into a position where that pad doesn't move at all. Because many lying leg curl machines don't have this cylindrical pad that can actually roll nicely. They have a pad that is actually more sort of rectangular. And if the rectangular pad is shifting in either direction, that's no good. So if the pad is shifting in either direction, right, which again is probably going to be uncomfortable, go back to this position here. What you want to play around with is just a couple things. The first and most obvious is where this is starting. So if you find it's rolling all over the place, just experiment. Okay, see what happens if you change the setting of this lever here and you move it this way, right? So it starts out lower. See what happens if it's already low and you move it higher. See what happens if you shift yourself slightly this way or slightly that way. See what happens if you change the starting position of this handle right here, right? Just play around, tinker with the settings on the machine such that when you're in the bottom versus when you're in the top, that pad isn't moving, right? You always pretty much want the pad to be pushing close to 90 degrees from you. If it starts to create friction between your skin and the pad, it's not going to be too comfortable. It's just going to feel super clunky. So the first thing that I touched on there was if the pad is going to roll, my preference is for the pad to roll closer to the knee as you curl up for the reasons I described. But in all other instances, if you're not super concerned about that, which to be honest, I wouldn't be, what I would do is just try to make sure that the pad is in the same place in the bottom as it is the top. Okay. So now that we've got all those pieces kind of collectively put together, I want to go over this one more point here that I'm illustrating in the exercise library. I'll move myself down here, which is this idea of curling in an arc, okay? In the bottom of the motion, right, we are pushing the pad where? We're pushing the pad upward toward the ceiling, right? So if I go to the top position, let's pause it again. This arrow right here represents the direction we're shoving in the bottom. Whereas the arrow that is representing where we are now is illustrating that we're curling this way, okay? So in the top position, your intent, how you're thinking about executing the motion, needs to be distinct compared to the bottom. Why? Well, because in the bottom, right, you can see this now, this arrow is indicating that you need to think about pushing the pad upward. And so a lot of times what happens is people's tailbones and their lower backs and their whole torso and even maybe their femur starts to shift all over the place, because instead of imagining this motion as two separate motions, which it really is, it's first motion of the pad upward, and then as the pad traverses through this arc right here, it's motion of the pad upward toward, so over here, like our head and our butts. If you're not thinking about the motion as two distinct phases, and you only imagine or really just are unconscious to these facts, your brain may be trying to just lift the pad upward. So what else is going to happen? Well, maybe your femur lifts upward instead. Maybe your back starts to arch a lot more because you're trying to lift the whole pad up, right, off of your base of support over here, right? So in essence, in short, you want to just imagine that this is actually two separate motions. The first phase occurs in the bottom, as I'm showing here, but then the second phase of the motion occurs in the top, where again, instead of thinking about curling the pad upward, you're thinking about curling the pad toward your butt. Okay, so in order now, sort of all together from start to finish, I'll let this play now, finally. Anchor the femur down, make sure that the bottom of the quads is on that bottom side of the pad. Make sure that you're pulling on the handles appropriately. You'll figure out what kind of direction of pull feels best. Make sure that in addition to the low pad placement on the quad, you want to start from a position where your kneecaps are pointed down. In other words, where your femurs are kind of touching one another. And then in terms of execution, you need to maintain the points of contact that we discussed earlier, again, in primarily femur right here, and then our pull on the handle in that direction. And then make sure that you don't lose pressure into those things as you go through the motion. And in addition to that, that you're curling upward first, and then backward toward the head, or sort of forward toward the head, however you want to say it here, so that you can appropriately match the arc of motion of the pad with the arc of motion of your shin, and so that your intent from the brain downward can be aligned with that appropriately. Okay, so I hope that helps. If you'll notice, again, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, this video that we're looking at right here is a part of my full exercise library, which is actually currently on a humongous 70% discount for the holiday sale, or the holiday discount that I'm doing. So if you're interested in this kind of video, I have over 230 exercises now, I think, in the library, all with this super, super detailed account, not like with the commentary that I'm doing. This is just for YouTube purposes. But all these different kinds of tutorials, right? Like all these different graphics that you saw here, these arrows here, these little nuggets of like, curl in an arc, first up and then back, right? All those things are included in these 30-second tutorials. And as a member of the exercise library, you can actually request a tutorial at any time. So if you enjoyed this video, I'm glad. If you didn't, sorry. And I'll see you all in the next video when we're going to be going over something probably similar to what we did in this one, just anything biomechanics related. So appreciate you all watching. Take advantage of the discount at that link in the description below, and I'll see you all next time.